Have you ever heard somebody object and say, how can you evangelicals be pro-family and vote for Trump? I mean, he's been divorced twice. He's on his third marriage. And, with Bill Clinton, you guys didn't do this. You said, oh, he's terrible. You can't vote for the guy because of this and that. But look at Trump. Trump's no angel. What's going on? What's with the double standard? Have you ever heard that before? Well, it's in news articles. I saw it in The Guardian. I was looking that up the other day. Actually, I got it as a comment on one of my YouTube videos. Oh, so you're saying Trump is in a state of continual adultery? And so I said, well, hey, I'm going to do a video on it. Let's just bring out all the facts. His spiritual advisor is Paula White. And as of February of 2025, and this is 2025 when I'm recording this, she's leading the new White House Faith Office, and she's on marriage number 3. In Mark chapter 10, verse 11, Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Those words aren't changing. So why are remarriages adultery? From God's perspective, the divorce and the remarriage are just legal fictions. They didn't actually happen. So the idea is when two people get married, God joins them together. That's Matthew 19:6. And when God joins them together, that's for life. That's not just an aspiration or a hope or a plan or a design or wouldn't that be nice or the intention on the marriage day that may or may not happen later. No. It's a fact. They're married for life. We see this in Genesis 2:23, where Adam says of Eve, she's now my bone and flesh. And that's Genesis 29:14 language referring to family. We even have it in the English language when we say someone's my flesh and bone. That's where that comes from, their family. In fact, in Leviticus 18, in the law, it says that it's incest for somebody to have relations with somebody to whom they're related, whether it's through blood or through marriage. Relations between those people is incest because they're family. The point is, it's family language. So when two people are married, they're married. Just as you can't unsibling your sibling, so you cannot unspouse your spouse. That confuses people because they're like, well, yeah, but people get divorced all the time, every day. I see them on billboards, get a divorce for $50 or whatever. Yeah, sure. You can get a government divorce. You can get a piece of paper. You can get an issuance from a judge or however the laws of the land work in that particular country and society. Sure, the government can say you're divorced and people can believe they're divorced, but God doesn't view them as being divorced. And hence why Jesus refers to a remarriage as adultery, right? Because all the paperwork in the world, the divorce paperwork, the remarriage paperwork, all the paperwork in the world cannot change adultery into permissible sex. It's not how it works. God's not going to be fooled by a bunch of paperwork. So that's why remarriage is always adultery as long as a prior valid spouse is alive. So that raises a question because, Trump's on his third marriage. It must be adultery, right? So let's talk about that. So the world is really asking with these questions in The Guardian and at NPR and CNN and everywhere else. What they're asking is, who's first in your heart? Is it Jesus or is it Trump? And they're just asking that question to make evangelicals uncomfortable with voting for Trump. No man can serve two masters. I gotta pick one here. Now, if it turns out, let me just say, if it turns out after we look at the facts that Trump is in a continual state of adultery and therefore he's barred from heaven if he dies in this state, it is what it is. It'd be wrong to deny it or make excuses for it or reinterpret the Bible to make us feel more comfortable with our political tribes. Nor should we reinterpret it to be more comfortable with our friends and family, which happens a lot, or our fellow church members. The scripture says what it says. If we try to reinterpret it to make ourselves feel better, it doesn't change the meaning. Jesus still said remarriage is adultery. That means something. If the choice is between the Bible and the art of the deal, got to choose the Bible. I'll just give voice to what you're already thinking, and I agree with you. Suppose Trump is in a continual state of adultery. Does that mean you shouldn't vote for him? Well, not exactly, right? Because when you vote, you're not voting for candidate A versus the perfect ideal candidate. That's not an option on the ballot, right? You're choosing between pros and cons between two different candidates, and there's a lot of things to consider. People consider economics, national security, social issues, and you might think, well, I'm not happy with this divorce remarriage thing, but also I'm not really happy that there are, around 1 million abortions every year. And I think Trump is more likely to do something about it than like the other person. So if I have to choose between those two, I'm going to elevate this issue over that issue. And so voting is more complicated than just what's their marital status. Nevertheless, since my channel really is geared toward evangelicals, and since there is this whole thing about voting for Trump and he's on his third marriage, and since I specifically got a comment on it on one of my YouTube videos as part of this podcast, I thought, let's address this question. All right, so let's go into the facts of Trump's specific case, because this is a fact-intensive thing that you have to do. All right, so the first thing to note is that in 1977, Trump married Ivana, and they divorced in 1990. And then in 1993, Trump married Marla, and they divorced in 1999. And then in 2005, Trump married Melania. Currently, it's 2025, and they're still married. So now you might think those are all the facts that you had. You might think, well, Trump was married to Ivana in 1977. He got a divorce, but God doesn't recognize that divorce. So Trump, from God's perspective, is still married to Ivana. And then he married Marla, and that's a fake marriage because he's really married to Ivana during the entirety of his marriage to Marla. So the whole marriage to Marla was just a continual state of adultery. It's a fake marriage. And then you might think, well, he married Melania in 2005, but still that's just a continual state of adultery because of Ivana. But it turns out it's a little more complicated than that. Were any of Trump's wives previously married? So as far as I can tell, Melania has never been married before. So that is fairly straightforward. As far as I can tell, Marla wasn't married before. However, one person was married before, and that is Ivana. So that makes this whole thing more complicated. So she married a guy named Alfred Winkelmeyer. I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly. Sorry, Alfred, if I mispronounced your name. So she and him were married in 1971, and they divorced in 1973. You might think that then Trump's entire marriage to Ivana was invalid, but it's even more complicated than that. I found an article where Ivana said that she never consummated the marriage to Alfred. The reason was the purpose for them getting married was a Cold War thing. She was trying to get out of the country, and so she married him, and that facilitated her getting out of the country, and then divorced him. The first question is Ivana's marriage to Alfred a legitimate, valid marriage, or is it invalid because it didn't consummate it and because of her motive? And the answer is it's a valid marriage. I don't think consummation of a marriage is required for somebody to actually be married. What matters is you have to have consent and the government has to approve it, and then it's a marriage. There are a lot of people who think consummation is required for a marriage to be a marriage, but I don't think that's the case. So number one, Adam and Eve were married in Genesis 2:23, in my opinion, when he pronounced her his bone and flesh. That was family language. And then Genesis 2:24, where it talks about them becoming one flesh, that is what you then do after you're married. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because one of the problems with saying you have to consummate the marriage in order to be married is that means everything leading up to the consummation is sin, which that doesn't make any sense. That you can't be married unless you sin on your way up to being married. That's just a kind of a weird construct that we've developed. The reason I think the place where that came from was people looked at Genesis 2:24, where it talks about becoming one flesh, and they thought, oh, that's when people get married. But that's not a requirement to be married. That's something you do after you're married. Sex is permissible in marriage. It's not required to be married. Okay, now, but what about her motive? She married him in order to get out of a country. It's a Cold War period, so this is back a ways here. So people might say, well, she didn't really intend to be married, so it's not really marriage. But that's not how this works. If you consent to be married, you're married. That's how that works. So if I consent to buy a house, but I'm not going to do normal house stuff with my house, still bought a house. That's, your reason doesn't prevent you from actually being married. What you could say is, suppose she had an inability, an incapacity to consent. That would be different. So suppose she was drugged, and on those drugs, then she consented to be married. And then when she kind of came out of it, she's like, oh no, what happened? I don't want to be married to this person. Then I would say, well, she didn't have consent at the time. She was incapable of giving consent. But that's different from she obviously totally pre-planned this idea of getting married to Alfred from the story I read in order for her to leave the country. So she did consent to be married because she wanted that as part of her ability to get out of the country. So she did consent to the marriage, and even though they didn't consummate it, still Ivana is married to Alfred. Normally, you'd want to go back and you want to see, well, was Alfred married before? Was Ivana's marriage to Alfred a valid marriage? And the answer to that is, I don't really know, but in a moment you'll see why it doesn't matter in this particular case. Okay, 1990 was a tragic year for Ivana. Her dad died, her first husband died, and her and Donald got divorced. That's a tough year. That's a lot of stuff in 1 year. Okay, so now you'll notice Alfred died, and her and Trump got a divorce in the same year. Well, that raises an interesting question. What happened first, Alfred's death or Donald's divorce? Suppose the divorce happened in, let's say, January, and then Alfred died in June. Well, that would mean then during the entirety of the time she was married to Donald, she was actually married to Alfred, which means her entire marriage to Donald Trump was a continual state of adultery, and it was invalid the whole time. And that would not prohibit him from then marrying somebody else because he was never truly married. But if Alfred's death was before the divorce, then that means for a period of time, Donald and Ivana were married. And now that does restrict who then the Donald could marry later. And it turns out that they had a long court proceeding because, Donald likes to be in court a lot, apparently. And so they had a long court proceeding. And it turns out Alfred died in August of 1990 from the records I can find. And the divorce wasn't finalized until December of 1990, according to the New York Times. So that means Ivana and Donald Trump were validly married for about 4 months before the divorce occurred in December of 1990. So then Trump's married to Ivana. He married Marla in 1993. So he marries Marla in 1993. Ivana's alive during the entire duration of that marriage. That marriage was divorced in 1999, and once the marriage is like fully divorced, now that marriage has no possibility of becoming valid. Like if Ivana were to die, because you have to have consent and government approval at the time of the death of a prior spouse before an existing marriage goes from invalid to valid. So anyway, so Marla, they get divorced in 1999. So that entire marriage with Marla was invalid. It was an adulterous remarriage that whole time. Then Trump marries Melania in 2005. Well, Ivana's still alive. So Trump's still actually married to Ivana, but Ivana dies in 2022. Trump was committing adultery with Melania until Ivana's death. So that was 17 years of adultery with Melania. And now that Ivana has died, Trump is now in a valid marriage with Melania. So that's a real marriage now that he's in with Melania. So now that Ivana has passed away, Trump is validly married to Melania. They should not get a divorce. It's a valid, real marriage. And what this shows us is when there's a lot of marriages and divorces and remarriages and deaths and prior spouses who may have previously been married before, you really do have to get all of the data on everybody going all the way back until you kind of get the ground truth, and then you can kind of work through and try to figure out who was married to who, and you can figure out what the current status is and if the current marriages are valid or invalid. So go ahead, subscribe, like, share, put in your comments. Let me know what you think. Get my book. It's called Divorce Your Remarriage. It's on Amazon.com. I have a link to it in the description below, and I'll see you guys next time.